If you're watching this video, it's because the people around you at your local card shop, their brain cells have fully developed and now they are wanting and willing to play Tengu plant format. And I am genuinely very, very jealous because for the love of God, Utah, please play this incredible format. I've been asking for years and, you know, to be honest, it's probably not going to happen. But I would love to play paper Tengu plant format. One day Utah will be down. But in the meantime, these other states, I know that these tournaments are popping up for everyone. So I wanted to go into a video talking about, you know, exactly what you can expect when going into playing Tengu plant, especially as a newer player to the format. In addition to go over some of the main pitfalls people fall into when learning the format. There's a lot of things that people kind of tend to do or drift towards, which isn't necessarily optimal. So I want to try to help you not fall into those traps. And then lastly, I want to go over my top 5 decks that I think will dominate your Tengu plant locals, decks that I think are very strong against what a lot of people are going to be doing, and also decks that I think are just very strong against newer players in general. So yeah, we're going to get into that, but first I really wanted to talk about the main pitfalls, and I think this is very, very important. So one of the first main pitfalls I think we should talk about is that everyone and their mother is going to be playing Tengu plants. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Tengu plants is still a viable deck, but people oftentimes misremember this format and look at it thinking that Tengu plants is just tier 0 and just far and away the best deck of the format. That is not the case. It's a completely competent, very strong deck, don't get me wrong. But that means a lot of people are just out the get-go. They're going to default to this deck. And that is honestly an advantage for you. One of the biggest weaknesses of Tengu plants is it is very easily sided against and really manageable if you're prepared for it. So side heavy for this deck. In addition to, I would maybe main a couple extra copies of Maxi, which is going to be very relevant in that matchup. That being said, this is another big pitfall of people in Tengu plant format is when they come into the format, they see that Maxi is at 3, and then they automatically think to themselves, I need to max out on this card. So everyone ends up playing a ton of copies of Maxi, and the thing about it is, honestly, throughout all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, guys, Maxi was relatively very balanced up until, like, way later on, probably from like 2016 on, where like Maxi really started becoming a problem. When decks started shifting to being way more special summon heavy and like very combo reliant, that's when Maxi became a huge problem. But prior to that, the card really wasn't that oppressive or imbalanced, and especially in Tengu plant format, it is nowhere near the level that people tend to think. So this is something that a lot of people get baited by. They think that they need to max out on this, and until people punish by playing decks that don't special summon as much, or, you know, that can play around it nicely, the card will seem inherently strong, especially, again, in an environment where a lot of people are on Tengu plants. So Maxi does go up in value against people, but I also would advise you not to play decks that are weak to this card, because everyone's going to be capped on like 3 of them. They're all going to be playing a lot. That's just a given. But that being said, Maxi is another important topic to talk about just in general. I think Maxi is probably the most commonly misplayed card in this entire format. For example, a lot of, like, just a couple plays to go off, just, you know, as an example, when your opponent summons Tour Guide, going around Tour Guide is really, really unique. You only want to Maxi if you know that they have Sangan Engrave and they're forced to exceed, like they have to exceed to break your board. So, for example, if they're going to go into Leviathan Dragon and you have no stop, it's good to just draw 2 off of that, right? So that's when you Maxi the Tour Guide effect. But a lot of times people will see turn 1, your opponent will summon Tour Guide, and then you go Maxi in response, and they're just going to summon Sangan and pass. You're going to draw 1, and it's going to net you nothing, which is not an optimal way to play Maxi. In general, you want to play Maxi when your opponent is like forced to special summon multiple times, and you can visibly see that that's about to happen. So that's how you're supposed to use the Maxi. That being said, the other thing that people often do with Maxi is, honestly, a lot of it revolves around Tour Guide, but they'll normal summon your opponent will normal summon a Tour Guide while you have a Thunder King on the field, and you fully intend on negating their Exceed with the Thunder King, but they'll Maxi while having the Thunder King. So when they go to the Leviathan, you negate the summon, which means you don't get the draw, so you're only drawing 1 in the same way. So that's another thing that a lot of people do, or same thing applies to like Warning or something, right? If you have a set Warning and they go into, you need to negate the Leviathan Dragon for whatever reason, then you don't want to Maxi there because you're not going to get the draw. So you know, it's just gonna 1-for-1. The only time it's like viable to do something like that is in the event that you just have multiple copies of Maxi and you really need to get rid of one to see something else. Then it's fine to just do a 1-for-1. But for the most part, especially versus things like plants, you really want to hold on to the card as much as possible and play it at the right optimal time. But I have an entire video on this subject. I go over literally every single possible meta deck in Tengu Plant format and show you when you could Maxi, how to play against it, what to do. So keep that in mind. I'll put a link to that video in the description below. I would highly advise checking it out if you're a new player to the format. That way you have a full understanding of how to optimally use this card, because again, it is so commonly misplayed by newer players. There's a lot of ways to play around it, so I will show you exactly when you want to Maxi. So check that out. We'll put a link to it in the description. And then the other thing I want to talk about, the last pitfall, is going to be Vanity's Emptiness. In the same light as the Maxi, this card is at 3 in the format, and people remember this card, and they're like, oh my god, that card's broken, and they decide that they want to max out on it, which this is a really bad idea. So this card is strong in a very select few decks. For the most part, it is very fragile and just not reliable enough. The main reasons for that is, one, MST is at 3, so you can break it really easily and it's just going to minus you. The other reason is there's a lot of inherent summons in this format through the likes of BLS, Chaos Sork, Hyperion, stuff like that. So you can't really chain to what your opponent's doing. So there's very few instances where you can really, you know, catch your opponent with the Vanity's Emptiness. And then the other one is the format's just not very special summon reliant. Like, you know, special summons are kind of like small extensions you do, which means that there's a lot of ways you can just out it by like normal summoning something bigger, like crashing with a monster, or attacking overing a monster, and then killing the vanities as through that way. So it can be strong in certain instances, but for the most part, this card is nowhere near the level, and most people do not opt to run this card just because it is so frail and fragile in this format, and it really doesn't accomplish what it did in later years of, or iterations of Yu-Gi-Oh, where the format and the game was way more special summon heavy, and you like could basically turn off your opponent's entire deck by flipping a Vanities. It's not the case anymore, so just keep that in mind. Don't get baited by that, but also be on the lookout for it, because of the fact that it is, you know, people do tend to think, oh, why isn't anyone playing this? I should play it, and then they'll play it. But it's not that good. But yeah, anyway, let's move on. We'll talk about what I think the top 5 decks of this format are. If you're going against newer players in a newer environment, I think these will definitely give you success, or the easiest chance of success, especially against what other people are going to be doing. So yeah, let's hop into that. So number 5 on my list is going to be Hero Stun. This deck is very generically good in Tengu Plant. It's honestly been on the rise. It's like probably one of the better decks in the format in general. And honestly, not a lot of people are going to expect it. One of the greatest advantages this deck is going to have against what people are going to be bringing is, like I said, a lot of people are going to be Maxi heavy. This deck is not hurt by Maxi in the slightest. So you can basically make all your opponent's Maxis dead. In addition to that, the thing I like about this deck, and this is something you should keep in mind when building it, is because Hero Blast exists and it not only will pop a card but also bring back Alias, it means that you can run a very low monster count in this deck, and then, you know, go more heavy on traps and consistency cards, which makes this deck just very consistent, very strong, and you don't really have to worry about what people are going to be bringing. Also, Thunder King is tremendously oppressive against the likes of Tengu Plants, so I just think against, you know, when people are bringing a lot of plants and a lot of Maxis to the table, this deck is going to just blow people out. It's going to be a big problem for them, and also will teach them a lesson about running too many Maxis. So if you're seeing Maxis floating around too much in your local tournaments, then this deck is going to be just the king of the castle for you. Coming in the number 4 spot, I have Psychics. And you guys already know, if you watch my channel, you know that I'm a big fan of this deck. But I also think this deck is very strong against experienced players, so it's going to be incredibly powerful against players that are newer to the format, mostly because of Psychic Jumper. If you don't know what this card does, it's basically a creature swap for Psychics, and if you're using Witch, you can, if your opponent's just like mindlessly attacking into your cards and they attack into Witch, then you can just special summon out or bring Jumper out on the next turn and steal their big monsters. People are going to fall for it. This deck is very floaty, and then another advantage for this deck is, again, it's also not really hurt by Maxi at all. It's not super relevant. For example, the only time people are really going to Maxi you is on the effect to special summon Esper Girl on your standby phase. and let's say you have Warwolf, you can just normal summon the Warwolf instead of special it and synchro for 5, and you know, you give your opponent a draw 1, but you're gonna also get a card, so it's like, and have board control, so it's not really a big deal. And that's like probably the most terrible thing they could do to you with Maxi. Like, Maxi's really not impactful on you at all. So yeah, I just think this deck is a really strong option. The only thing I will say about it, if you're a newer player to the format, is don't get caught up in playing Witch and then immediately going to Esper Girl. You only want to get Esper Girl if you have a non-tuner that's viable and you want to make a synchro play. So for example, Reborn Tengu or Warwolf, if either of those guys are in your hands, even Wizard if that's in your hand, then Witch getting Esper Girl is really, really good. But if you don't have anything, then just go Witch into Witch. It's completely fine to do that. So I talk about that in my guide. I have an in-depth guide on the deck if you want to check that out on my channel. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But yeah, that would be my number 4 slot. I think this deck is very, very strong and super difficult to play against if you don't know what you're doing. Coming in at number 3, we have Scraps. Now this deck is honestly strong for almost the exact same reasons that I talked about before. We got triple Thunder King in the main deck. That's very, very strong against Tengu plants. Also, this deck is almost like control based, so it doesn't really special summon a whole lot, which means it's not very weak to Maxi. And you have so many tremendously good stopping points. Even if they Maxi you on a Scrap Chimera, either making the Scrap Dragon, giving them an extra draw isn't necessarily always a big deal. Or you can just stop and sit on your Beast Warriors or Beasts because you're getting Horn of the Phantom Beast set, so you know, you can just play around things like that. So this deck is super easy to just kind of coast with. It's not a big deal, but the main reason why I think this deck is really strong is because 90% of people who haven't played this format in a while are going to not remember the fact that Scrap Dragon has a floater effect, and that applies even if this card gets warning. So for example, if you have a Tengu on board and you normal summon the Scrap Beast, the correct play is for your opponent to warning the Scrap Beast. But a lot of times they'll be like, oh, I'm just going to warning the Scrap Dragon, because in, you know, most instances that's going to make sense. But when you synchro with a Scrap Beast and they warning it, you just get to special summon another Tengu and then special summon the Scrap Beast back from grave and just do it again. And that play alone is why I think that this deck is really strong against newer players, because I guarantee you they'll make that mistake once and only once, but that's enough to win you a game, and this deck is already inherently strong, so if that wins you a game, then you'll probably win an entire match off of it. Obviously, as your locals gets more keen to understanding how the deck works, it's not as great, but this deck is still very, very strong and has won tournaments in Tengu Plant format, so it's not a huge concern at all. So I would highly encourage going for Scraps for all those reasons. Number 2 on my list is going to be Nordics, and I put this at number 2 only because of the fact that I think this deck is a bit weaker to Maxi. So in the event that your opponent is running a ton of copies, it can actually be really annoying. But that being said, I would say most Nordic players will tell you that if your opponent doesn't know how to play against Nordics, this deck is like Thanos strong. Like, I swear to God, this deck will just dominate your tournaments if your opponents don't know how to play against it. Nice thing about it is if your opening play is either Tour Guide into Sangan or normal summoning a Tengu, even setting a monster, 9 times out of 10 your opponent's just going to randomly attack into it, and you can just blow them out with a Greygo into like Ancient Sacred Wyvern, for example. There's a lot of ways for this deck to just explode on your opponent. It's very, very strong, so that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're playing this deck. Is like I said, weak to Maxi, but also just absurdly high OTK potential, and if your opponent doesn't know what they're doing. And like I said, I think there was a tournament in South Dakota recently. There was like a Tengu Plant tournament people played, and Nordics ended up winning that, because again, I just genuinely feel if you don't know how to play against Nordics, you will just get completely blown out by Nordics. So yeah, I would think about that. If you want to learn more about this deck, I would watch my video with Dave Trepanier. He is the creator who topped YCS Toronto with Nordics. I can put a link to that video in the description as well. And my final deck in this video is going to be Falcon Punch. This deck is the Infinity Gauntlet of all the traits I said were positive from the decks before it. It's not weak to Maxi. People will, you know, play poorly into it if, you know, they don't know how to play against it, which most people will not. They probably likely have never seen this deck before, which is going to be a huge, huge advantage for you. How this deck plays is you use Abuse, Call the Haunted, and Limit Reverse in addition to Mist Valley Falcon and Dragooni Darkspear. These cards are going to infinitely resource loop your cards, and if your opponent makes like a single misplay, it's so easy for this deck to just take over. You'll gain so much advantage and just dominate. This deck is also, like I said, not weak to Maxi, so your opponent is going to have a lot of dead cards against you. This deck just offers a whole ton of options, and I also like that it runs one of every hand trap, and you end up, you know, using Sengen to abuse and search the right one at the right time. So you're going to easily be able to just kind of crush out your opponent. If you want to see some gameplay of this, in my recent live stream, in my most recent live stream where I played all the decks, I played this deck against Tengu plants and ended up winning. So if you guys want to see how that all played out, then you can check that out. But in reality, this deck is kind of a slow, grindy deck that just ends up fully taking advantage of your opponent in their misplays. The real way to beat it is they need to save their MSTs to hit your Call of the Haunted and Limit Reverse when they're activated, like chain to them, so you don't get to bring stuff back and loop them. That being said, a lot of people won't know that or won't know how to play against it. So if they don't and they just blindly throw out their MSTs, then once you get your loop going with like Call of the Haunted, Limit Reverse, and a Mist Valley Falcon, you're gonna just take over the entire game. So it's a really, really powerful deck, and I would 100% advise giving this one a shot, because even when people figure out how to play against it, it's still very, very strong, super powerful deck in this format that, like I said, most people just haven't seen before, so they're not going to really know all the cheeky things you can do, but there's a lot this deck does. It looks kind of bizarre, but it actually does do quite a bit. But that's going to wrap it up for this video, you guys. Let me know in the comments if you're an experienced Tengu plant player and you know of any other decks that you think are really good against newer players. But also, you know, let me know if this video helped you. If you took, you know, one of these decks to your locals and ended up dominating, or if any of my advice helped you out. I'd really like to know about some success stories. That'd be really cool. But other than that, let's give a quick shout out to the Patreons. Thank you to Slap God, my dude, Photo Shooty, Brian Ford, and Sven Olbrehend. Thank you guys so much for the support. I genuinely really appreciate it. But other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and have a great time dueling today.